Hey, what's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast. I am Connor O'Gara. No Will. He is in Baton Rouge. We will have, by the way, no official statement yet from Will's camp on what happened in Death Valley on Saturday night. He will be giving his full thoughts on the preview pod. So if you came here being like, I want Will to eat a bunch of crow, you're going to have to wait for that, unfortunately, as we told you on the preview pod. But Will is going to be able to, trust me, he's going to be able to give his team plenty of crap because, wow, did they get whipped on Saturday night. I must first pay off my bet to Doug Maurice. If you listen to the summer pod, you know where I'm going with this. I have to say that the North does know a thing or two about college football after Georgia suffered its second regular season loss. I said, if Georgia goes 10-2 or worse, I will have to eat that. And then if they only have one loss in the regular season, then obviously he would have to say the South knows a thing or two about college football. But he was right. Georgia looks much more like a team that could end up going 9-3 than a team that deserved to be 11-1 in the regular season. He was right. I was wrong. So we will have tons and tons of thoughts on what happened in Oxford, obviously, and just a huge, huge win for Lane Kiffin. But yeah, week 11, I don't feel like really cleared up that much in the SEC. We now have 3 teams in the conference that are sitting there with just one conference loss. It's kind of crazy. We have 7 SEC teams still that have 1 or 2 losses overall. Bama, Georgia, Mizzou. We're going to get to some Mizzou playoff thoughts because Drink just tried to throw that into the college football atmosphere. And then we have Ole Miss, obviously, Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Texas. Those are the teams right now with 1 or 2 losses overall. And it feels like we have a lot left to sort out. But we did get a muddied playoff picture thanks to what happened in Oxford. Oh, boy. Let's start with that. Lane Kiffin, Toby Keith win. Toby Keith win. Biggest win of his career. Not even close. Not even close. Like, even go back to beating Oregon 2011. You win that game on the road. You prevent Oregon from playing for a national championship. It's big for what you're trying to build. It kind of sets the stage for USC to start off as this preseason number 1, obviously in 2012. And Lane, we know what happens after that. We've talked about it many, many a time. But they weren't even competing for a postseason berth, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, they weren't competing for a postseason berth because of sanctions. So what that win got you was morale. It got you feeling good, off-season good vibes team, which USC definitely was. This is just so much different. It's so much different in every possible way. Lane Kiffin finally gets the win that has eluded him forever. And Ole Miss got it as a whole because that was so unbelievably gritty. And that is not something that we have used to describe Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. They have been the prototypical flashy, NIL-based, modern, non-purist program, and they went out and delivered a gritty performance to be able to keep their playoff expectations alive. And, consider all the factors, right? Because we know the opponent. We know the opponent's Georgia. We know that beating Georgia still carries different kind of weight, but you've got rainy conditions to start off. And when Lane is talking to Molly McGrath beforehand about the conditions, he didn't seem very confident that his team would be favored in that setting. Did anybody else get that sense listening to Lane? And Lane in his pregame stuff we know is a bit weird, get your popcorn ready and all that. So maybe he's just trying to say something that won't come back to bite him. And he was trying to walk the line of saying, yeah, the rainy conditions are about to favor us because we know how that starts. But man, the rainy conditions favored the identity of this Ole Miss team, as crazy as it is. When you have a defense like what Ole Miss has, and you've got a Georgia offense that is struggling right now to compete in normal conditions, much less atypical rainy conditions on the road, hostile atmosphere, yeah, you're in a favorable spot, and Ole Miss took advantage of that. First Ole Miss win versus an AP top 2 team since the 2015 Bama win. Remember, Georgia number 2 in the AP, number 3 in the playoff poll. Lane's highest ranked win ever. He is the first non-Alabama coach to beat Kirby Smart since Dan Mullen 2020. How about that? He is the only coach at his current job who can say, yep, I beat Kirby Smart. Outside of course, Kalen DeBoer. The only non-Bama coach who can say at his current job, yes, I beat Kirby Smart. 52 consecutive Georgia wins against non-Bama teams. That streak is over. Lane Kiffin brought that up in the post game. You can bet that'll be on some sort of Saban disciple text chain. Not sure that Kirby and Lane are going to have a whole lot of back and forth with their interactions. Very different places, very different emotions exiting that game. A premature field storming results for Ole Miss. Gosh, it's a tough look. It's a tough look, Ole Miss fans. I get it. Act like you've been there before. You kind of haven't. And you get to experience that. Like, you still have to be able to snap the football and obviously kneel it when there's 16 seconds left and your team takes over after fourth down. But nonetheless, just a wild scene. Goalposts come down. They didn't have a river to put it into, so they just put the goalposts out on the square. It's the best place for them. That's fair. Better the square than the Grove. I mean, the Grove, I'm not sure those will ever be seen again. You're probably hurting some trees doing that, but the square, no, that's probably the way it should be at a place like Ole Miss. We're going to get to the Georgia aspect here, okay, because there's a lot of takeaways there, but Lane deserves his flowers, man. He really does. You're without your top two running backs. You're a team that can't run the football against good competition, right? They have struggled so much in ways that we are not used to seeing. And so these chunk plays and this offensive floor, staying on schedule, it's just been a difficult thing for Ole Miss in SEC play. And you're without Henry Parrish, you're without Matt Jones, so you're down to your third string guy. And I get it, Ulysses Bentley the fourth. He's got a lot of experience when he scores that touchdown and he says, "This is my blah blah blah." I'll agree to disagree based on kind of the snap count that started off the year, the bizarre snap count for Ulysses Bentley, but nonetheless, he still had that big time moment early on, and you're able to muster something in the ground game. And it wasn't pretty, so let's not pretend like all of a sudden they had third and fourth stringers coming in there and breaking off 25-yard gains. That wasn't the case. But on top of that, Ole Miss is without Trey Harris, aka the guy that was running laps around the SEC, in terms of receiving yards, was looking like he was on his way to a runaway Bolitnikoff award before he got hurt. He's still not back. And after the first series of that game, you're looking like you're going to be without Jackson Dart, because not only does he throw a pick on that opening series, but he gets hurt and he limps to the medical tent and then to the locker room immediately after that. This could have been a horrendous day. I mean, a terrible day. When that first series plays out, Georgia takes over from 21 and scores that touchdown. I'm thinking this is about to be Ole Miss at Bama 2021. Ole Miss fans, you remember how that game started. It was Bama, and then some more Bama pretty much from start to finish, and kind of took the life out of you, a team that you felt like was going to be able to compete. That was the get your popcorn ready game for Lane Kiffin. There was reason to actually consume popcorn if you were an Ole Miss fan during this one after what was just the worst possible start. Maybe there's something to be said for that. Maybe there's something to be said for kind of getting punched in the mouth and feeling like, how are we going to respond here? Because you can have the atmosphere and you can feel like you're ready for the challenge, but until you actually see it play out and you know what you have to do to be able to combat that, sometimes it's a little bit tougher. So this horrendous start instead is the clear low point of the day. At no other point after that, those first two drives, one for Ole Miss, one for Georgia, and I guess you call it a drive, even though it was 21 yards, Georgia picks it up, picks up the fourth down conversion, which at the time looked like a really gutsy, smart, bold call by Kirby Smart because you get the touchdown. But outside of that, man, just all Ole Miss. All Ole Miss. This was a day that Lane Kiffin will never, ever forget. Ever. Okay. And I don't care if Georgia goes on to miss the college football playoff and this win doesn't end up looking as good. Let's remember how we feel in this moment. Okay. Let's be present with this. All of those portal players that he got were huge. And that's worth discussing here. Okay. We will get to that, I promise. But I think the key, the overlooked thing, that if you're hearing people talk about this, on Monday or something like that, and they're saying Lane Kiffin finally gets a big one, Austin Simmons. Austin Simmons is the guy who was originally a class of 2025 recruit, right? And then he reclassifies to 2023. He does the dual sport thing because that's just what Ole Miss does, baseball and football. And he ends up beating out Walker Howard for the backup job, which was news in the beginning of the season when that happened. Now, Simmons is a redshirt freshman. He just turned 19 last week, and he was able to do that in camp, and there was pretty much no mistake about it. Like, this kid is going to be special, and he has shown those signs of being the quarterback of the future. So when Jackson Dart goes to the locker room and he comes in, and you're like, is this about to be a disastrous day? And on that second drive, he was brilliant. He totally flipped the entire atmosphere and made it so that instead of turning the ball over 3 and out or something like that, and then Georgia with this struggling offense gets another short field, he marches Ole Miss right down the field. He's right on schedule. He's not off target. He's hitting these guys in stride with room to run, just as the scheme draws up for you. And he was incredible. And leading that touchdown drive is so important in that game, because you did not want Ole Miss to fall behind 14-0 or even 10-0 at the start of that game and then feel like you got to throw out your game plan and you got to scrap everything. You had to scrap everything by having Austin Simmons out there in the first place, I guess. But yeah, apparently all you got to do to beat Kirby is bring out a lefty backup quarterback who wears number 13. Austin Simmons looks so much like Tua, it's scary. Guys, I should have brought this up long ago. I guess I hadn't seen him outside of, maybe like with his helmet on or something like that. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. But when I saw him with his helmet off, and I get it, he's 6'4". Okay, I tweeted out that he looks like, are we sure can we see Tua and Austin Simmons in the same place? I get it. He's built physically, like he's different and all that stuff. So I hear it loud and clear. But I mean, the resemblance is uncanny. And obviously the presence that he had in that game, even though it was very, very brief and Jackson Dart shows that toughness and comes back in the game, it was monumental. And by the way, his game isn't like Tua. Maybe I'll make that comp 1 or 2 more times just because it's sitting right there. But we'll save that for a later date. Obviously, though, story of this game, the Ole Miss defense, what it did to flip that result, it's amazing. And look, the story of this ends up being that Ole Miss's defense did what every sort of booster could have hoped for when they signed those NIL checks. For real. I mean, that's the world that we live in. Lane said that this game was a year in the making because when you lose like that to Georgia and you lose 52-17, you get your teeth kicked in. You feel like you're at that level, and then you see what it looks like to be at that level. And you have the ability now in this day and age to, if you want to, make those changes, get that commitment. Say, if we get these pieces, this is what we can do. It's a little bit like, for those who play fantasy football, it's a little bit like an auction draft. You don't have to worry about the snake draft. Am I getting my guy? You want your guy? Like, go pay for it. Go pay for him in the auction draft. Go out and spend that money if you really want that player, and then make excuses about. You don't have to make excuses about it. And to flip that result, 52-17 to 28-10, man, that is hard to do, and it doesn't happen just by simple development. We got to have the right kids. It just felt like this Ole Miss defense was clearly, and that defensive front was the best unit on the field. Perkins, who's been a revelation, go figure, that Centarian Perkins ends up being the best Perkins in the SEC this year. Unfortunately, the Harold Perkins Jr. injury played a part in that, but Princely Omonmi-Allen, man, ooh, those Georgia tackles, they're gonna have some rough time in the film session watching that one, the way that it played out. Carson Beck was pressured on 40% of his dropbacks. They said on SEC Final that's the most he has ever been pressured in a start. Yeah, Ole Miss, 9 TFLs. It's actually a little bit low for him, if we're being 100% honest. 5 sacks in this game. Georgia had 3.8 yards per play. Beck didn't have multiple picks, but he still had the multiple turnovers because he lost the fumble. He was just an inevitable fumble down the stretch with the pressure that they were getting. And it started to feel a little bit like what Ole Miss ended up doing to Oklahoma, where they just take over and an offensive line is searching for answers. They couldn't do anything. Georgia's trying to get a chip block from the tight ends, and that's not working. Nothing is working. At one point, it felt like Georgia's biggest offensive play of the night, besides that 4th down that they were able to convert into the touchdown early on, was going to be the Cass Jones forcing a face mask because he recovered a Carson Beck fumble. Yeah. But Ole Miss then, of course, just squashed that. No touchdowns allowed after that opening drive that started from the Ole Miss 21. I mean, just crazy to think about the job that group did. Just a remarkable response. How about Pete Golding? Let's get this guy's obviously in contention for lad of the week. Might just go ahead and name him lad of the week right now. But this is a guy who, let's call it what it is. He's been made fun of for the last how many years? Alabama fans, easy guy to make the butt of the joke. It's never Nick Saban's fault that the defense is doing what it was doing. It's Pete Golding's fault because the way that he looks and the way that he came into that job, and he wasn't this decorated defensive coordinator, and Saban kind of rolled the dice on him. And Lane Kiffin says, you want to work for us? You want to not necessarily have to deal with that same sort of Saban cloud that hangs over you, and that's always going to make you in the wrong, and you're never going to get credit for it, and you want total autonomy. Here you go. And that move has paid off. It really has, because we can talk all we want about getting the dudes, and you do have to get the dudes, but you have to get the scheme. You have to get the scheme, and you have to get guys that can dial up those pressure packages. And man, have they found ways to do that. And Pete Golding deserves immense credit, because Lane Kiffin, we know it's been a revolving door of coordinators for him so far, and he was not too pleased that DJ Durkin was poached by Texas A&M. He's been pretty blunt about that, needless to say. And by going out and doing your own poaching of sorts, Bama will tell you, okay, if they wanted to keep Pete Golding, they could have kept Pete Golding. I get that, but still, the job that Lane Kiffin did to recognize that need and address it, truly address it. Not just throw money at the problem, but find the person that, you might take some crap for to hire, but that's the guy. And Pete Golding has been that guy. If he's not in the Broyles consideration, something's wrong. Something's wrong. He has just exceeded all of these expectations. And when we're sitting here in the offseason talking about what this Ole Miss defense could be and all the dudes that they added, it doesn't always work. Pete Golding himself came out and said, it's great that we have all these pieces. We still have to make them fit. And if they don't fit, and if they don't buy in, and if they're taking plays off, and it's, this guy got that money and this guy got this, it won't work. Okay. The margin for error might be greater in the college football playoff that has 12 teams in the field. It is still not very great in the SEC. And they have been the driving force for this team. They're the driving force in that game to be able to frustrate this Georgia offense. All right, Georgia offense. Actually, you know what? Let's back up. Let's talk about Georgia as a whole here. Georgia came into the season coming off of 13-1 and was returning preseason All-American quarterback and Carson Beck. And not just that, but 28th in the country in percentage of returning production. I'm pretty sure that that's easily Kirby's most production he's had back since Bill Connolly started tracking this. And maybe he started tracking this at SB Nation beforehand. I just couldn't find the archives, but I'm pretty sure that is. If it's not, it's very close to it, because usually they're the team that loses all this talent to the NFL draft, and then you don't really worry about it that they're 105th in percentage of returning production, because it's like, yeah, they got more 5 stars. They'll be just fine. But this team had the pedigree. It had the areas of weakness seemingly addressed. It had the quarterback situation. You had coordinator continuity. You had all of these elements that you could have hoped for from a roster standpoint. And given how difficult the schedule looked, this felt like the perfect type of roster to take that on. What is very clear as we enter mid-November here is that this team was not built for these tests. This team was not built to handle the rigors of this schedule, which I do believe is the most difficult in college football among contenders, at least. We can get into a debate if Florida's schedule is more difficult. Georgia, by not having to face itself, I guess it gets the benefit from that. But you get what I'm saying. Among the contenders, among the playoff resumes that we will sit here and break down ad nauseum over the course of the next month, nobody, and I mean nobody, holds a candle to Georgia's schedule. That sounds like I'm making excuses. It's not. Here's what I mean. In an alternate world that still has the SEC East, Georgia would probably end up being an 11-1 team who would get to Atlanta and have this false sense of confidence. I was texting with my guy Emery about this, maybe a bit 2018-ish. Okay. maybe a bit. And that team ends up, of course, having a fourth quarter lead in an SEC championship and it's setting itself up to be able to make it to the college football playoff for the second consecutive year. We know what happens after that. But this is a different sort of beast for Georgia to conquer. And this is wild to see this late into the season with the areas that we thought they would be at worst solid. This team doesn't have an offensive identity whatsoever. Okay. They showed the splits of like Carson Beck, facing pressure versus not facing pressure. And it's alarming. Like it's alarming to see a team that doesn't have someone to turn to on third down. And here's what I've noticed watching Georgia. And maybe this is a little bit too skewed from the fact that Brock Bowers got to be a relevant part of that offense for 3 years. And Ladd McConkey, he might not have made some of these unbelievable highlight reel plays, but then you go back and watch the replays of the way that he would get separation on third down or something like that. And you would just think that changes what you can do. When was the last time we saw a Georgia pass catcher do something that was truly impressive? Answer that. I struggle to think of it. Maybe a nice move in the open field. Maybe a tight end hurdle that I'm forgetting. I think Oscar Delp had one of those early in the year or something like that. When was the last time that you looked at this Georgia group of pass catchers and thought, oh man, they just really helped out Carson Beck? Now, Georgia leads the country in drops, and part of that is probably on Carson Beck as well. Okay. And I realize that's a weird thing to say about a very receiver-centric stat, but they're just not on the same page. Okay. Whoever you want to blame, they are not on the same page. And this is a group that has struggled mightily in ways that I could not have ever imagined. Obviously, the fact that they're facing an elite defense in Ole Miss is a huge part of it. Okay. They have faced a lot of elite defenses this year. And that's definitely a reason why we're sitting here talking about this group searching for answers, feeling like it's just an inevitable turnover. 4th and 10. Who in the world thought that they were going to convert that 4th and 10? Nah, did not feel particularly optimistic. And part of it, I guess, is they just don't have those advantages in the trenches on the offensive line that you thought that they possibly could. But it's a disaster. It's a disaster. You can talk about guys fumbling in rainy conditions, whatnot. Yeah, that's a bummer. But Georgia just doesn't have any of those guys right now in the pass game. Either a Carson Beck dot, an unbelievable, oh my God, this is why you just got to overlook the bad stuff. Take this guy in the first round type of throw, or a wow, look at what this receiver just did to help him out. Even George Pickens, and look, I'm not a George Pickens guy. Even George Pickens could give you that, okay? A little back shoulder fade. Jake Fromm just sort of throws it up to him, go up, make a play. Where is that guy? That guy is not on Georgia's roster. He is not there, and that has plagued this team. There's no doubt about it. They don't have necessarily the wide open space scheme, okay, that it looked like they had at different points last year. Mike Bobo deserves blame for that as well. But no piece of this offense should make you feel particularly good. And I think Georgia fans are fully acknowledging that. It's a very, very different feel than last year. All right, enough on that. They also showed the splits of Jackson Dart against the blitz and him not against the blitz at some point in the third quarter. And it was lopsided. Given the ankle injury that he suffered early on, I was blown away that Georgia wasn't bringing more pressure and trying to force him into some of these quick decisions. Now, you could definitely say, well, these corners, you can't put them on an island. Jackson Dart, he's going to pick you apart. I don't know. He still picked them apart. Who cares? You know, they still were having some success, and it just felt like they weren't willing to necessarily dial up these looks with all out pressure that I felt like Jackson Dart would have had a tough time being able to escape. Again, I am not pretending to know the ins and outs of Georgia's defensive schemes at all times. I'll leave that for the people that are much smarter than me than all things X's and O's. But when you see a stat like that and you're kind of thinking about it, like, man, they really haven't dialed that up. it doesn't, you don't have to be a football savant to realize, yeah, more pressure and being able to send it would have been at least something that you feel like you have to go and have to try out. But yeah, Georgia only had 1 sack and 1 forced turnover. You know when that was? First series. That's that is not the mark of a Glenn Schumann defense, of a Kirby Smart defense. Definitely not the same group that we saw take over that game in Austin a few weeks ago. And that's just not going to work on the road against a talented team. And you saw those Ole Miss, those Ole Miss pass catchers. They might not have gotten the big time chunk plays, but they had enough space to be able to operate. Jordan Watkins wasn't necessarily video game type good in the way that he was against Arkansas, but he was still plenty good to be able to win in this game. I thought it was doubtful that Jordan Watkins was actually doubtful as he was listed on the availability report. Okay, what's even the point of these? There's an actual distinction here in the NFL that you have to abide by if a guy's doubtful and whatnot. And I guess, it's a little bit different in the college ranks, and Lane seemed to take advantage of that. But nonetheless, that wasn't the difference in the game. Question I think Georgia fans are asking right now: can Kirby navigate this and make the playoff? Because you got to face Tennessee. I think losing to Ole Miss the way that Georgia did kind of changes the playoff resume, And yeah, you don't have 2 blowout losses on your resume. And you have the really, really impressive win at Texas, which is as good of a win as there is in college football this year. Okay, it still is. But I was saying before, 9-3, Georgia should still be in the college football playoff. You go face Tennessee and you get blown out, man. I don't know. And by the way, Georgia still got Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech just handed Miami its first loss as well. This schedule, if Georgia doesn't figure things out, it can absolutely trip them up. And they have to figure it out right now. I mean, that's undeniable. Georgia said that last week after Florida hung around with a team that should not have been on the same field with all the injuries that they were dealing with, and they somehow were at the end of that game. But the story of the day, the story of college football on Saturday was Lane getting this one. It's a really difficult thing to do, to make college football fans change how we feel about you. Okay. It takes a long time. And for someone that is so brand entrenched in the way that Lane is, with wanting to be the fun one, right? He's the fun uncle of college football in a lot of different ways. Well, can the fun uncle take care of the 4-year-old kid for an entire weekend and not necessarily have a trip to the emergency room? Can he do that? Because that's essentially what Lane is what he was being asked to do this season. And he has become a more serious team than people gave them credit for. And I'll include myself even at that point, because I definitely, after the way that things were unfolding for them, coming off of not only the Kentucky loss, but the way that they folded down the stretch against LSU, I said, I don't want to talk about Ole Miss in the playoff conversation. I don't want to. Show me something that you haven't shown me before, and then we can talk about that. Well, that's what that was. You have now shown that. Now you're sitting there 10-2. You've got 10-2 on the table. I shouldn't say you are 10-2, but beat Florida in Gainesville. Okay, not a given. TBD on DJ Lagway. Going to get to that in a bit here. Win the Egg Bowl, which, buddy, you'd better. Get to the playoff 10-2, maybe host a first-round playoff game. Successful season, regardless of what happens after that. Get people to change how they feel about you. Get people to change how they feel about Ole Miss. If Ole Miss had missed the playoff this year, those conversations. Man, Lane's never going to be able to do it. He's going to have to, if he ever wants to be able to get to a championship program, he's going to have to find somewhere that, they just have a different sort of tradition, a different sort of floor, and Ole Miss just ain't it. That would have been the conversation had they not beaten Georgia, and if Ole Miss would have been eliminated from the playoff conversation. Instead, that doesn't happen, and you've got a chance to be able to move on and have this season that you hope to have coming into this year, and not be the butt of the joke. Not be the butt of the joke. Nobody was laughing at Lane. Everybody should have been taking off their cap, applauding the job that he was able to do to turn this result around the way that he did so drastically. All right, Bama, LSU. I haven't checked Twitter. I haven't turned on the TV this Sunday morning here, but has Jalen Milroe stopped running all over LSU yet? Is that Does that happen? Maybe. I couldn't tell you. Doesn't feel like it. They should have let Fake Mike the Tiger see if he could play in the second half of that one, just so that Jalen Milroe, I'm probably not going to get taken down by Fake Mike the Tiger. I don't think he had that kind of aura about him, but just a little bit of fear because Jalen Milroe feared nothing. He did not fear Death Valley at night. He did not fear anything that LSU defense was throwing at him. 12 carries, 185 yards, 4 touchdowns for a quarterback. Including last year's LSU win, Jalen Milroe had 340 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns in his only 2 games against LSU. Jalen Milroe owns Brian Kelly. He owns Blake Baker. I think he owns Fake Mike the Tiger. He could have walked out with that thing, and I don't think anybody would have cared. Turns out LSU's run defense issues did not stop when Marcel Reed walked off the field in College Station a couple weeks ago. Basically, last 5.5 quarters of football for LSU, they allowed 10 rushing touchdowns. 10. 4 against A&M, 6 rushing touchdowns that they allowed against Bama. In that stretch, that 5.5 quarter stretch, quarterbacks, 21 carries for 247 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns. Basically, opposing quarterbacks against LSU's defense have been Ashton Genty. I mean, good Lord. I thought we would see LSU adjust during the bye week. And again, there are people smarter than I am when it comes to X's and O's that can tell you what those adjustments should have been, what they would have looked like. From my perspective, and when you watch some of the replays of these runs, it looked like they would basically have one guy that could make a play and he would whiff and then it's gone. Guy's not getting off blocks, and then you're just not going to be able to arm tackle Jalen Milroe when he's got a head of steam. And he was getting to that second level way quicker than any LSU defender could handle. Okay, that was very, very obvious. LSU looked like it flew from College Station to Baton Rouge. They walked off the plane and then just tried to play Alabama. They said, guys, shower up. We'll get new uniforms, whatever. We got a game right now. we got a doubleheader, because that was the same team. That was the same team that finished that game at A&M that showed up against Bama. And man, it was just such a disappointing showing from an LSU defense that looked like it was really emerging. It did. It wasn't that long ago that I was saying that's why you pay Blake Baker all of that money. That's why he gets $2.5 million after you gut your entire defensive staff. And look, I'm not going to pretend like stopping Jalen Milroe is easy. Okay, it's by no means an easy thing to do, and it's almost the type of thing where if you're an opposing fan watching the Bama offense, you kind of have this ability to poke fun at it and say that it's limited and look at all these bad sacks that Jalen Milroe takes and whatnot. And then you actually see what it looks like when he turns the corner and he's running against your defense, and you think, oh my God, they have no chance of bringing him down. It's a difficult thing. Okay. And both things can be true at the same time. He has shown both sides of his game this year and last year as well. And this has not been a linear process with him. Okay. It's just been the fact that the good is still really, really freaking good and basically impossible to stop. I would have loved to have known how many teams truly could have put the clamps on the player that we saw on Saturday night. I'm sure there are some, but that was a man possessed. He really was. And look, it is really hard to feel like Jalen Milroe is going to be in the Heisman Trophy conversation or anything like that. But I was thinking about this, watching him do what he did on Saturday night. I think his legacy at Alabama will just be, he should never be counted out. That sounds really basic, but we're not going to do the thing with him where we end up comparing him to Bryce Young and Tua and Jalen and Mac and all these different guys. They're very different players, and what they did well is different than what Jalen Milroe does well. The closest comp to him is obviously Jalen Hurts, and I even think it's way different watching what Milroe is enduring and the way that he is playing in this scheme, the surroundings, all those different things. But it's always been with him. You think this guy's cooked. Maybe it's quarterback battle. Maybe it's poor play, bad interceptions. Maybe it's wrong fit in the scheme. You think this guy is cooked, and then he just finds a way. And he finds a way. And this year he looked cooked playing in an offense that was searching for an identity. Didn't really have something reliable to turn to down the stretch against Tennessee when they needed to have it. And on Saturday night in Death Valley, where Brian Kelly had never lost in that setting, Jalen Milroe and the Bama offense knew exactly what it wanted to do. That was joyless murder ball. That's what that was. It was joyless for LSU. I know that for sure. Here's the crazy thing, though, and this speaks more to Milroe's night. That might have been lost in the shuffle because it felt like Bama just got every blade of grass that it wanted in the ground game. Bama's running backs didn't have a carry of 10 yards. Ryan Williams did. Jalen Milroe did. But Bama's backs did not have a carry of 10 yards. So it wasn't like anybody that was getting a carry could just break off 20, 25-yard gains. That wasn't the case at all. The traditional ground game wasn't necessarily this driving force. You know, it was still good enough to be able to kind of supplement Milroe to where it's not like, oh my God, he's the entire offense. But I mean, there were points where he was the entire offense. Milroe was just so good in space. He's out there navigating a running back as a lead blocker and then cutting it back all the way across to the other side of the field. He just always looks like he's in control. And he wasn't sacked once in this game. They converted 10 of 13 on third down. That's good. You do that on the road, you're going to win football games. And who really cares that Bama couldn't throw the ball that well in this one? If you're Kalen DeBoer in this game, you're not worried about how much your offensive identity is shown in a win. Who cares? Go win a football game. Go win a football game. Do the thing to take advantage of a defense's weakness, exploit it, and then live to fight another day. That's what they did. Go win a football game. Keep your playoff dreams alive in a place where dreams are supposed to go to die. Speaking of Kalen DeBoer, in year one, beat Kirby Smart, beat Brian Kelly in Death Valley at night. Not too shabby. Against top 15 teams as a head coach, dating back to even year one at Fresno State, where his first month on that job, he was beating a top 15 team. Or I guess, no, second season, did that in 21. He didn't do that in 20, my bad. But against top 15 teams in the AP poll, he's 10-3. If DeBoer was the can't win the big one guy, this schedule would have already chewed up Bama and spit him out. Okay? Not quite on the level of Georgia's, in my opinion, but it's pretty darn tough. It is pretty darn tough. Instead, Kalen DeBoer just became the first coach to win in Death Valley at night. Have I mentioned that yet? Since Sam Pittman, 2021, when he beat an interim coach-o who was the interim coach for himself. In my opinion, DeBoer's realistic year one expectation and what was always going to define his first season, nationally speaking, we don't judge year one coaches, or at least I don't judge year one coaches on the show. It was always going to be make the playoff, make the 12-team playoff. Do that, okay. We can talk about what your championship upside is. You can sell a vision in the transfer portal. You can sell these recruits that you know what you're doing, that you're not just going to instantly step in and mess it all up. Do that. Take care of business, get to the 12-team playoff, and then build your program from there. Establish your offensive identity. Again, Saturday night was not about Kalen DeBoer trying to establish his offensive identity. There is a 0.0% chance that game plan would have ever been rolled out with his personnel at Washington. Totally different. And Kalen DeBoer deserves immense credit for that, because you can be stubborn and say, well, I know this works, and I got to this point in my career by doing this offense, and this is how we're going to win. No, don't do that. I cannot emphasize that enough. And that is the difference in that football game, because if Jalen Milroe doesn't get those design runs and they lose that game, Kalen DeBoer's got nobody to blame but himself. But instead, he recognized the obvious weakness in this LSU defense and exploited it. So now you're sitting there, if you're Bama, with a very strong possibility of going 10-2. Not a given, okay? Still going to be a difficult challenge when they face that Oklahoma defense, but still, given what we've seen from this Bama defense, we're going to get to in a second here, you'd feel pretty good about that matchup. And, of course, never rule out the idea of Auburn doing an Auburn thing. But again, that game is different in Tuscaloosa than it is at Jordan-Hare. But you're feeling like, man, 10-2 is realistic. Maybe home playoff game. And that could be on the table even if they don't get to the SEC championship, because when you win games like this that make us nationally go, whoa, okay, not too shabby, that is going to impress the selection committee. Oh, by the way, okay, we got some breaking news here. We got breaking news from Will. I asked Will for a statement 2 hours ago, knowing that Will was not going to be up. He's an hour behind, so I'm not giving Will crap. Will said, and I asked for a 1-sentence statement from the LSU side. He said, quote, "I can't believe we looked so unprepared this deep in the season at home." Not wrong. Yep. I told you, Will was going to tell it like it is. Okay. He's not going to come up with a spin zone. His team got absolutely mopped. All right. And I'll make sure that Will gives this unit the respect that it's due. But for now, I just will. Bama defense, man. Kane Womack. Maybe people will pronounce your name correctly. Like you deserve to have your name properly pronounced now after that type of a showing. Garrett Nussmeier was totally out of sorts in this one. Not full on seeing ghosts, but the pick to Deontay Lawson, I just thought was great eye discipline from Lawson to make that pick in the red zone. Look, we question the discipline of this group. It's been a popular topic of discussion, even in games where the scoreboard suggested that they were fine against Tennessee. You saw the penalties down the stretch, and they just didn't do enough to win in that type of atmosphere. But they held LSU without a touchdown, man. That's 2 consecutive games of holding an SEC team without a touchdown. Yeah, one of those games was against Drew Pine. I'm going to say nicer things about Drew Pine later. I promise, Mizzou fans. I'm going to get to it. Much different to do it against LSU, who's coming off of a bye week, and an LSU team who started off like looking like it was going to have this fun back and forth game, maybe reminiscent of what we saw last year pre-Jaden Daniels injury, Dallas Turner hit. But LSU gets the 45-yard run from Caden Durham and looked like it was maybe going to be off to the races in this one. And, that was just not the case at all. LSU, once again, kind of gets away from running the football. I don't know how much the 2 dislocated toes for Caden Durham has to do with that. They showed the different shoe that he's been wearing. He's wearing basically a steel-toed boot out there. Look, I don't know what LSU's ground game identity is. I won't pretend to have an idea, but Garrett Nussmeier turns the ball over 3 times. The fumble being the most costly because of when it happened. That happened in a 14-6 game after LSU had just gotten this huge 4th down stuff of Jam Miller. And it's this great moment for LSU. All right, like maybe they withstood some of this, this early Bama dominance. They're going to be able to put up a fight in this one. LSU gets decent starting field position there. I think they were starting from their own 40. And then boom, that very next play, Jahad Campbell forces the fumble. Tim Smith pounces on it. Bama takes over, and LSU is just like, what just happened? 2 Milroe runs later, it's Bama up 21-6, and that's kind of all she wrote. That was sort of it. Nussmeier, he feels to me like in baseball when there is the decorated prospect who comes up to the big leagues and he tears it up early on. There's all this confirmation bias of like, yeah, this has been a long time coming, man. Like this guy is going to be special. He's going to be the face of the franchise. He's getting a lot of attention. And then meanwhile, as this is happening, big league pitchers are getting a book on him. They're finding his weaknesses. They're kind of slowly chipping away. They're developing a scouting report at that level of what he can handle, what he can't handle. And that second month is just a lot tougher for that player. Like those guys eventually realize, because they're professionals too, you'll chase high heat every time when you're behind in the count, or you really don't shorten up on 2 strikes. Or if you do, you're not really protecting the outside part of the play. Just these little things that if you're at this level, people can pick up on. And that's kind of been the case with Nussmeier. There are things that defenses have shown that have fooled him. And I thought the Lawson pick, they did a great breakdown of showing how Lawson looks like he's following this receiver, and really he's just sitting there. He's actually in zone coverage, and the way that Kane Womack was disguising coverages where you think it's man and then it's zone, and you think you have this and you don't. And for someone with Nussmeier who throws with anticipation, that's a difficult thing. And he wasn't processing that at the level that LSU needed to be able to sustain some of these drives. But, and this isn't all on Nussmeier. Okay, because the interior of that LSU offensive line really struggled to keep him clean. Some of the blitzes that Bama was dialing up. I mean, you had guys running through the A gap untouched. And I don't know that keeping him clean saves LSU season when it's a game that's that lopsided, but I just like I think that was the only way. Nussmeier playing brilliantly and going blow for blow with Milroe. That was the only way that LSU was going to be able to keep its season alive. Okay, and that goes back to A&M as well. They needed him down the stretch to make those big time plays because for whatever reason, LSU just is not a we're going to bleed the clock out, run the football type team. Game flow of this game was obviously very, very different. That was never going to be able to happen. But LSU's playoff path is now done, just like that. You've got two teams blocking you with Bama and A&M. So even if you're sitting there hoping to be 9-3, maybe in the conversation, it's just not going to happen. Plus that USC loss early in the season, that looks a lot worse than originally expected. I mean, so that's not helping you. You've got a bad loss on top of that, in addition to having a blowout loss. And I guess the A&M loss, was it a blowout loss? I don't know, but we're not going to be dissecting LSU's playoff resume. On the bright side for Brian Kelly, at least he doesn't have to answer questions about his late game execution. That's good. Maybe. He can instead have the focus the rest of this regular season, the rest of this offseason be on the entire game. Kelly's going to go into year 4 without having made the playoff yet, which depends on your perspective. If you go by the perspective of LSU with 39 scholarship players in a bowl game, when he's watching this team that he's about to inherit, that probably changes how you feel. If you go from the perspective of this guy is still the active leader in consecutive 10-win seasons, you probably have a different perspective as well. That could still be on the table if they went out. Here's what I do know. He's not about to get $67 million to walk away from a program that he just led to those consecutive 10-win seasons. So let's chill with that. All right. That's just not going to happen. But the danger and what Brian Kelly now faces in this new SEC, you're going to watch all these rivals play for a playoff spot. Really critical juncture for the Brian Kelly recruiting element, which Bryce Underwood looks like he's still locked in. Was at that game. TBD on what that Michigan NIL offer looks like. But you're at a really critical place because of all this new competition. Now you've got this Texas thing. And what does DeBoer look like with his first full cycle? And all these different elements that you're juggling, and you don't want to be the coach that looks like he is trending in the wrong direction. Brian Kelly's going to get time. Okay? Brian Kelly doesn't have at least 5 years at LSU. I'll be stunned. But it's a long offseason. It's a long offseason when you're a team on the outside looking into the 12-team playoff. And it's going to be painful because USC and A&M, those games were right there for the taking. They really were. And this game definitely was not there for the taking. Maybe it should have been if LSU had planned a little bit differently, but it was very much unprepared, and there was no doubt whatsoever who the superior team was. Bama now, playoff path is sitting right there for the taking, and I can guarantee you there are a lot of people who tune in on Saturday night, whether they want to admit this publicly or not, but they're thinking to themselves, buddy, I hope we don't have to see Jalen Milroe in a playoff situation. All right, South Carolina, Vandy. Diego Pavia is human, not Heisman, human. Finally, Vandy fails to cover a spread. Finally, Doors met their match, lose at home. Spoiled home fans. I mean, finally see their team lose at home. It just probably didn't handle it particularly well. No, I'm just kidding. Only 2 sacks for South Carolina in this one, but one of them was Kyle Kennard getting to Pavia in the red zone, gets the fumble. Vandy rarely turns it over. And they had red zone points 33 of 34 trips this season. So to have a turnover in that spot, it's one thing to have a missed field goal, but to have a turnover from your most reliable player, that certainly changed the tide of this game. And it's a huge play because I thought if they're able to convert there and they're able to to go ahead, they're able to kind of play their game flow, and Pavia is able to settle in, and he never really settled in this one against that South Carolina defensive front. We thought that could be obviously a major hurdle for him to be able to clear, despite the fact that obviously he has had no shortage of impressive performances. But the biggest play of the game for me wasn't actually that. South Carolina is coming out of halftime. They're up 7-0. It's looking like it's going to be one of those games where maybe it's 14-10 or something like that, or similar to what Vandy just did at Auburn last week. Maybe it's a 17-7 type game, but it's 7-0. They're backed up on their own 15 after a holding penalty, first play of the second half. And Sellers looks like he is about to take a horrendous sack on the goal line, reminiscent of what Jalen Milroe took against South Carolina, ironically enough. And you're thinking to yourself, oh man, you can't just keep drifting and drifting. You have to know where you are in the field. Are they about to take a safety? Maybe it's going to be 7-2, or at the very least, it looks like South Carolina is about to all of a sudden have second and forever from its own goal line. And then you're going to give the ball back to Vandy, midfield, something like that. Instead, Lenore Sellers shows the growth. He doesn't panic. He does exactly what he did last week against A&M. He somehow slips out of this tackle. He keeps his eyes upfield, and he hits Jared Brown for a 51-yard gain. It was just like what he did against the Aggies, and that is so demoralizing for a defense when you feel like you have a guy dead to rights against his own goal line. He Houdinis his way out of it and is able to extend this play and totally flip the momentum of the game. 2 plays later, Rocket runs it in from 33 yards. South Carolina makes it a 2-score game against a team that, let's be honest, Vandy has done amazing things. They're not built to come back from a 2-score deficit. That has just not been the MO of this team. I love the development from Lenore Sellers. I really do. Give Dowell Loggins credit, man, because I think the things that he has shown with his quarterbacks these 2 years, even though scheme-wise, there's definitely some stuff to be desired, I think that you have seen these guys in season take steps. And if you watch this team closely, you see a better product than what it was with the previous version of that. And Sellers, I think, is just one of those guys that needed more reps. He does need to be more secure with the football. That's still very much a learning process for him. But, I think South Carolina, the last 2 games, what's been a huge difference is that, yes, the standout plays are when Lenore Sellers just has a guy coming untouched and he just shakes him off like a rag doll. Those are the plays that stand out. But still, South Carolina's offensive line has been a lot better. Haven't allowed a sack on the last 2 games. Okay. That is so much different than what it was previously. And there's not a coincidence that in these last 2 games, he's averaged 10.5 yards per attempt against actual defenses that we respect. Because when that guy gets some protection and he's healthy, he's a pretty good quarterback, man. He is not a fun guy to play against for 60 minutes. Even Bama had its difficulties playing against Lenore Sellers for 60 minutes when the protection wasn't as good that day for the Gamecocks. Offensive line is just benefiting from continuity. They have the same group basically all year. After last year, I think they have 8 different starting offensive lines they said on the broadcast. And the other part of it, obviously, Rocket Sanders continues to ball. 178 scrimmage yards, 3 touchdowns, just so explosive. He is back to his 2022 form, and it is so fun to watch. He's not going to be fun for Mizzou to tackle. I'll tell you what. Look, that Oklahoma offense against Mizzou, I don't know that they had guys, especially with Barnes out. They didn't really have those guys that felt like they were that difficult to bring down. But Rocket and Sellers are not going to be a fun matchup for that Mizzou defense. But Beamer gets to celebrate a bowl berth, gets to celebrate that 6th win, should be able to celebrate a top 25 ranking in the playoff poll on Tuesday. He was saying afterwards, yeah, please don't rank us. Fine, whatever. I don't know what the selection committee's looking at, but whatever. Don't rank us. We're just going to keep winning football games. There's not 15 teams in college football better than South Carolina this last month. There's not. Okay. And if you haven't been watching this team, or if you just kind of wrote them off after they got blown out against Ole Miss, I'll tell you what, they are brutal to have to line up against for 60 minutes. And they just kind of continue to show that they know how to handle this success. And that's maybe the biggest difference. Now, can they handle Mizzou, who has had Shane Beamer's number? That's a monumental test for South Carolina. South Carolina fans know if you win that game in a strange way this year, that's almost a bigger hurdle to clear than what it would be to beat Clemson. That sounds strange, but Beamer's already got the Clemson win. He already went into that Death Valley and won that game a couple years ago, obviously. But yeah, I think that South Carolina has a chance to win out. I really do. I think they have a chance to go 9-3, and it's not particularly crazy. Oh, one more thing. Diego Pavia is suing the NCAA to get an extra year of eligibility. We found that out on Friday from Pete Thamel, I believe it was. No, it wasn't Pete Thamel. My bad. I'm just so used to giving Pete credit for every breaking news story in college football. Apologies. I don't remember who was first on that. But basically, Diego Pavia was citing the JUCO restrictions and how that shouldn't necessarily count against eligibility, blah, 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 whatever. I know it's been a tough go for Pavia the last month, really. If you watch this Vandy offense, it's been a little bit different than what we were seeing against Bama when he was healthier. I don't know what the final injury report with him will end up being. It'll be probably pretty extensive. He's going to have to get on WebMD for a lot of that stuff, I'm sure. But I do know that I support any and all efforts to keep Diego Pavia in college football forever. If we can find all these ways to keep Cam Rising in college football when he's going to be like 28 next year or whatever, let's find ways to keep Diego Pavia in college football, suing the NCAA, whatever. Let's find a way. I also know that if I'm Hugh Freeze in this spot, and I even just know there's a greater than 0% chance of this happening, blank check Diego Pavia's address, blank check to his brothers. They showed his mom during the game in this one, blank check to her. I don't care. Do whatever you can. Get that guy on your team just so that you don't have to face him and potentially have a fourth consecutive loss because yes, Vandy and Auburn, they do play again next year. Oh, that would be so sick for Hugh Freeze to have to stomach if he had to face Diego Pavia a fourth year. And who knows what the situation that could be unfolding for him if that's a game where your career, your job could be on the line. Wouldn't you rather have Diego Pavia on your team than not? Anyway, yeah. Wild story. Not necessarily surprising. I actually am a little bit frustrated that I didn't suggest this at one point that Diego Pavia should just sue the NCAA and just try and get whatever you can to spend another year in college football. I'm sure Vandy would do whatever it would take to be able to keep him there for another season. Mississippi State, Tennessee. Is it weird to say that I sort of hated this game for Tennessee? And not the result, not the final result. Tennessee fans, you should feel happy that you are sitting there in mid-November, one of three teams in the conference without multiple conference losses. The other two schools from Texas, those are the others. That's good. That's a positive development. And there are so many years in which you know the alternative. All right, so we don't need to go back to Jeremy Pruitt, Butch Jones. Horror stories, but you get why it feels good to be at this point of the season and to be relevant, to be in the top 10. That is a win. We're going to have more time to talk on the preview pod about Tennessee's playoff path if it can't beat Georgia, because obviously if they win, 11-1 feels pretty darn realistic, and the path to be able to get to the SEC championship, that opens up as well. So I'm acknowledging that, okay? But Tennessee had some uneasy developments on the offensive side of the ball that had nothing to do with the scoreboard. And if you looked at the box score of this one, maybe you wouldn't have even picked up on it as much. And by the way, so close I was to nailing the score prediction on this one. I had 31-14, ends up being 33-14. Just saying, your boy finally missed one. Just kidding. Let's start with the Nico injury. Weird play. Don't even really know what the injury was. Looked like his arm kind of got hit awkwardly. If you watched him walk to the sideline afterwards, it looked like he was straightening his right arm. Make of that what you will. They called it an upper body injury. Weren't going to get into specifics other than Heupel saying that was a precaution. They expect that he's going to be ready to go for Georgia. That's good. He didn't play in the second half of a game that wasn't a blowout. Okay. And you could tell me that game was never in doubt. Fully get it. Tennessee was going to lean on the ground game. Gaston Moore was going to come in and be able to manage that game, not turn the football over. That's fine. But the more troubling development for me is this should have been the perfect opportunity to let Nico throw the football 30 times, play a full game, get some good vibes going with your receivers, celebrate some touchdowns with them. And he got some of that in the first half, right? Like you got a little bit of that with the long play to Squirrel White, and then he hit Dante Thornton later on. He, by the way, also left this one as well later on. But you should have had a day that allowed you to feel good against the worst pass defense in the SEC. Did this day end up being that? No. That's not going to end up being the headline. 13 pass attempts, 8 completions in this one. You would have liked to have been able to either play 60 minutes and get to have those throwing opportunities, or you're playing 3 quarters and you've already thrown the football 25 to 30 times. That would have been a nice development for a Tennessee offense that has clearly struggled with the downfield passing attack. But I look at that and I just wonder, I don't really know that I feel particularly confident about this passing attack yet. And also, because of that injury, what happened in the second half was another kind of frustrating development. Nico gets hurt, and we see Dylan Sampson also get banged up on the night in which you would have ideally liked to have your workhorse back, the guy that's getting way more work than anybody in the SEC, have an early night, get a little shower. And instead, the fumbleitis issues continue with him. 3rd consecutive game with a lost fumble. He ends up getting banged up in the first half of this one, comes back in, ends up getting 30 carries. Did not expect to be able to see that. And that's good. He had the 33-yard touchdown later on. If you kind of watched him running off the field, you're like, that guy's not at 100%. It's great that he's at 20 rushing touchdowns. And it's awesome if you're a Tennessee fan that Josh Heupel has adjusted in the way that Auburn fans wished Hugh Freeze would adjust with Jarquez Hunter. Just feed that guy the rock. I don't want to hear that he's gassed. I want that guy to I want that guy to talk about how sore he is on Tuesday or Wednesday if it means being able to win a football game and maintain relevance. And that's the good news for Tennessee. It's still, though, I'm a little worried. I'm a little worried. I love Dylan Sampson. And I love the idea of giving the ball to your best player and finding a way to just survive in advance and figure everything else out later. I get it. And he has certainly earned that right. He now, by the way, has more rushing yards than any Tennessee player since 2015, Jalen Hurd. Crazy. Okay. Guys had a banner year. He had 39 more carries than the next closest SEC running back entering the night. And that was Jarquez Hunter, by the way. Samson. Wow. We're not going to mispronounce his name. He has earned the right to have his name correctly pronounced. Dylan Sampson now has 69 more carries than any other SEC running back. Does Heupel have much of a choice? Maybe doesn't. You know, Peyton Lewis got 14 carries on Saturday night with Deshaun Bishop out. I think Heupel at this point is kind of looking at a situation, just going, I need to do whatever I can to possibly just make the playoff. Just make the playoff. We're not a team right now with the weaknesses we've shown in the past game that realistically is going to win a national championship. The championship DNA that you looked like you had against Oklahoma early in the season when everybody was just so overwhelmed with everything Tennessee was doing, maybe this realization has come of, I don't need to play the long game. I need to just win games and get into the playoff and then figure all that stuff out later. That feels like the Josh Heupel plan. Okay. And I'm not sitting here knocking it. I'm just saying it's not always ideal. Okay. And I think you can see in any given game, stuff like that can happen to Nico. Stuff like that can happen to Dylan Sampson. And all of a sudden you're wondering, what is the potential of this team? Okay. That sounds like a really critical thing to say of a team that just won a game by 19 points and is, going to be in the top, 6 at least in the college football playoff rankings on Tuesday night. But I worry a little bit about Tennessee with the Sampson injury heading into Georgia week, plus the Nico thing, plus Dante Thornton, plus this offensive, I don't want to call it regression. Yeah, it's regression in the passing game. Let's call it regression. But the good news, Tennessee still has not given up 20 points this season. That defense continues to feast. It's awesome. It's great. It's fun to watch. Maybe that can lead you to the places you want to go. Maybe that can be the difference in a game against Georgia when we just saw that Ole Miss defense be the difference in a game against Georgia. And if you're a Tennessee fan, you're holding out hope that that is going to be the case. And maybe, just maybe, this is the right time to catch Georgia. Or maybe it's not. You're going to be 10-2 and wondering if you're going to have a chance at the college football playoff. Florida and Texas. When we did the preview pod, it was before the Scott Strickland statement on Thursday that Billy Napier would be back for another season. So I'll get to that in a second here. As that relates to this game from a micro standpoint, I do wonder if the timing of the announcement was anticipation of what was going to happen in this game. Instead of having days of getting calls left and right after a blowout loss against Texas. You don't have to worry about that as much. You instead have to worry about why ABC did Florida so dirty by showing the statement as Florida's losing 42-0, and they show what Scott Strickland said, and Scott Strickland's on the sideline wearing the visor, and you're like, buddy, this image is not going to age particularly well. Could have shown it when it was 0-0. Maybe we get this one up there in the first quarter, and instead they hold out. Yeah, let's get this in the later on in the game when it's 42-0, and Florida doesn't look like it belongs in the same field as Texas. You could tell me that's not what competitors think like, and I get that. But Florida knew that DJ Lagway wasn't playing in this game. Okay, and I know that he warmed up. And I know that I said in the preview pod, don't rule out the possibility of him playing in this game, because I still think it was a greater than 0% chance. But they were leaving the door open publicly, while privately, Billy's comments to the ABC crew made it seem like they were letting him do individual work in practice. He wasn't going to do team stuff. He was going to always be kind of with the second teamers. It wasn't truly going to be a game time decision. And the focus was, let's see how you feel. Let's get you ready for LSU. That was the overall sense that you got, because when he shows up at the start of the game, obviously in shorts, you realize he's not even going to be an emergency quarterback. Good, because that Texas defense, I don't think they would have been particularly kind to DJ Lagway. I think that would have been ugly. It would have been extremely risky even to have him as the emergency quarterback, because what happens if you fall behind 3 scores? Do you then bring him in and hope that he can win? Nah, like, don't even leave that on the table. Don't even have that as an option, especially if you already have gotten this vote of confidence from your athletic director, who we're going to get to in a second. We had to watch poor Yale transfer Aiden Warner take the brunt of it. Did I mention he was a transfer from Yale? Preferred walk-on. Texas came out and did what it was supposed to do, perhaps with the exception of some of the gap discipline in the ground game. Florida was able to do some things better down the stretch. Very depleted Florida backfield that gave some positive film at the end of that game. But Florida's roster as a whole is just, it's down bad. I mean, you're down 3 receivers, you're down 3 starting defensive backs. So when it's 14-0 in the second quarter, after Texas looked like it was getting whatever it wanted, and it was against a very depleted Florida defense, Warner had put together this nice drive, and it was to get to the Texas 7-yard line. Florida has 4th and 2, and Billy opts for a field goal to try and make it a 14-3 game. You know how hard it's going to be to get into the red zone, okay? You know that those opportunities are not going to be very frequent, given the challenges Florida's facing against this Texas defense on the road. You also know that despite your best wishes, you're not following your own game plan of making this an ugly, low-scoring game. Just because you opt for the less points avenue doesn't mean that this game is about to become ugly. Florida needed touchdowns, okay? Instead, field goal attempt to try and make it a 14-3 game, but instead, Florida has this false start, maybe intentionally, because the way that the college hashes are set up, I think teams sometimes do that to get a longer kick, to give your kicker a better angle, at it a more comfortable angle. Nonetheless, move the kick back 5 yards, miss the kick, ball don't lie. For the next hour of real time, the only thing that Florida was fighting for was to extend its FBS record of games with a point, which, in case you didn't hear 50 times in the broadcast, Florida has not been shut out since 1988, aka the Ronald Reagan administration. Florida took care of that in the third quarter, did some better things running the ball, whatever, don't care. It was the type of sequence, though, and Florida fans, you know I'm right about this. It was the type of sequence that made me wonder if Billy is ever going to have a feel for these big-time moments. Not as significant as the 2-point decision against Tennessee, obviously. Not going to be magnified in the same sort of way. But as he gets this year 4, this vote of confidence for a year 4, no amount of talent is going to make me move past these decisions. And I get that it's great when you see the Pete Thamel report about how 70% of Florida's NIL commitments right now are tied up to freshmen and sophomores. So you feel like you're building there. You're getting those guys a lot of reps. These injuries, we're going to hear about this a lot in the offseason, about how these injuries down the stretch gave these guys a lot of playing time, and that's going to make them a much better team. They're going to be able to take that next step next year. Get ready for that spin zone because it's coming. It's probably already here. There's going to be a significant commitment to the transfer portal with Florida, because when your freshman class right now, as it stands, last I checked, it was 51st in 24/7 sports rankings. You're probably going to have a difficult time recruiting for the next 8 months as well. You're going to go to the portal, okay? That is inevitable. And if Florida doesn't go to the portal and spend a ton of money, dead man walking, that's what Billy Napier will be. I just wonder if Billy's ever going to seize these moments. You know, you have to beat the teams that matter. And I'm not saying that they were ever in a million years going to make the right decision and go on to win that football game, right? We're just talking about this in a vacuum. But if you're going to talk about how great it is, and I'm talking about people from the outside, right? If you're one of those people that looked at this vote of confidence on Thursday and said, you know what, it's great that Florida didn't do the knee-jerk thing and pay this $26 million buyout. And you know what, maybe this is going to be the first coach of the post-Urban Meyer era to earn a year 5. Yeah, what a crazy sentence that is. Maybe all those things are true. Are those people then going to talk about how Billy is 2-14 against AP top 25 foes, and one of those wins was in the first game that he coached? They better. You better talk about that stuff, okay? Because not everybody deserves patience. And I understand there are elements here that you can sell if you're Napier, and I understand wanting to see the DJ Lagway experiment through. I fully get that. You're probably not having any world in which you're going to keep DJ Lagway while firing Billy Napier. And I get it, wanting to just double down. I am not necessarily of the belief that Florida opted for that move just because they looked at the future revenue sharing and the $20 million essentially salary cap that they're going to have to pay. I don't think they looked at that and thought, you know what, we shouldn't pay a coach $26 million. You know, no, they had the money ready to go. Okay. They were willing to make that big time spending. It wasn't like all of a sudden they said, oh, wow, we're going to have to pay this money. Guess we better not pay a big time buyout. Guess we better wait until it gets down to $10 million. No, that's not the case. Now, if they had been 3-9 this season, yeah, different story. The progress they showed midseason, that definitely helps. The fact that we actually got to see DJ Lagway, that helps. But now, Billy Napier is, again, going to be on every hot seat list in America, as he should be. He's under contract through 2027. So he's next year going to do the very rare thing for a power conference head coach and have only 2 years after this upcoming season. He's going to say, can't recruit. Maybe his agent's going to say that. I don't know. Jimmy Sexton Klein, I'm sure. I just assume these days. For those wondering about how vague the wording was, I do think they wanted to leave themselves some sort of an out if unforeseen circumstances, something off the field happens, fake death threats happen. Now, what if Florida had that happen twice in a 7-year stretch? That can't happen. But Florida has learned enough. Just never say never with something going totally wrong or some sort of NCAA show cause or something like that, which should be basically a dinosaur in this day and age. But just leave the door a little bit open, but he gets to be able to come back. That is what they are planning to do. I continue to wonder if there's going to be an SEC coach fired. Maybe we're going to get some sort of movement with a resignation. Maybe Mark Stoops steps down or something like that. Or maybe we have a rare case in which there's an intra-conference poaching or something like that with something in the carousel. I don't know. But a firing, maybe not. Maybe not, which that hasn't happened since, I believe, 2018. I think that's the only time in the last, 18 years that's happened. I'm going to have to look that one up, especially if it does happen. Oh, yeah, Texas thoughts. Texas played in this football game, too. Texas didn't even play that well on offense, if we're being honest. And by halftime, it felt like they were ready to put in the second stringers. Okay. Longhorns playoff path is pretty ideal now with Arkansas. You got to go to Arkansas. Obviously, lost there 21. I think Texas is in a much different place now compared to 3 years ago. And then you have home against Kentucky, and then you're at A&M. But even if Texas loses the A&M game, 10-2 Texas, with what the selection committee said about them in this first ranking show, I think they're still going to get a ton of respect. I don't think that they are going to be all of a sudden in jeopardy if they lose that one game. Who knows? But I think Texas should feel really, really good about its playoff path, even if it doesn't necessarily include an SEC championship. Oklahoma, Mizzou. If you weren't locked into this one, maybe you were watching Bama and LSU. There's a lot of good college football on Saturday night. if you weren't locked into this, just go back and watch the last 4 minutes because it was bananas. It'll be worth your time, I promise. For a bit, I thought we weren't going to get any touchdowns in this game. And if you look at the box score and look at how this played out, you're like, what do you mean? And then Drew Pine rose from the ashes. He shut me up. Oklahoma, if you didn't see the sequence that played out, how bananas this was. Oklahoma was down 16-9 after Mizzou missed an extra point. And there's 3:30 to play. It's 3rd and 4 in the red zone. Sooners just have to have it. Joe John Finley, the interim OC, he draws up a little throwback pass from running back Taylor Tatum to Jackson Arnold. The first OU touchdown of the night comes on a catch from Jackson Arnold, your quarterback. And that wasn't even one of the top 5 weirdest things that happened in this game. We also had Oklahoma earlier in the game successfully execute a fake punt jump pass that Bauer Sharp catches and then hurdles a dude, which that was fun. That was weird in itself. But anyways, a minute later after the Jackson Arnold touchdown catch, Mizzou fumbles. It's a scoop and score for Billy Bowman, who was a man possessed. He had a huge big time hit on Luther Burden earlier in the night on 4th down that just reminded you, man, this Oklahoma defense is playing really hard. Billy Bowman somehow always right place, right time for that guy. And it looks like, oh my God, Oklahoma is somehow going to win this with 2 minutes left. Felt very reminiscent of what Oklahoma did to be able to steal that game from Auburn on the road as well. Except Mizzou is in Auburn and apparently still had a pulse down the stretch. Mizzou drive with 2 minutes left, 3rd and 16. Oklahoma somehow kind of forgets to cover Luther Burden the third. The DB also fell down. The DB looked like he could have maybe made a play on this, but I think there was too much separation that Burden had. And on the left sideline, Drew Pine couldn't overthrow Luther Burden on this throw, though it seemed like he tried. And then Drew Pine throws a dime to Theo Weiss in the end zone. He gets his foot down, tie game again with a minute left. Oklahoma gets the ball back with a minute left. You're thinking maybe, drive down the field, get a field goal, walk-off win or something like that. Nope. Mizzou scoop and score for the win. Ball game over. It made no sense. It was bonkers, the end of this game. The timing was actually really good in terms of like when, the other SEC games kind of, had fallen off and you're able to truly lock into this one. But yeah, it felt like these teams were back in the Big 12 playing against one another. Just a wild, wild finish for a game that looked like it was going to be 9-6 or something like that. Great bounce back win for Mizzou coming off of the bye and knowing that you weren't going to have your guy, your captain Brady Cook out there. Mizzou was feeling so good, or rather, Eli Drinkwitz was feeling so good that in the post-game interview with Cole, he said, quote, it gives us Cole was asking him what does this win mean for your locker room and all that stuff? And Cole was basically asking a question of how important is something like this just to get the vibes a little bit better after it had been down. That's how I interpret it. Drink did not. Needless to say, Drink said it gives us another win, keeps us in the playoff hunt. And then Drink looks directly into the camera and says, that's right. I said it. Playoff hunt. Okay. So how if you have to explain a joke, it's not funny. A playoff argument doesn't really land when you have to look into the camera and say, that's right, after beating a 5-4 team who has one win in conference play. If any Mizzou fans disagrees with that, or you just don't want to hear me say that because I'm not a Mizzou fan and I'm not, banging the drum for you, just ask yourself this, okay? Do not just simply look at, why would a 10-2 team from the SEC ever get left out? Mizzou lost by a combined score of 75-10 in 2 games against current CFP top 25 teams. It doesn't have a win against a current CFP top 25 team. Maybe it's going to get one of those wins against South Carolina, who, if they beat South Carolina's then going to fall out of the top 25. So if your best argument is, we won 10 games, get in line. Get in line. I don't want to hear it. Bama and A&M will both block Mizzou from the playoff path that Drink thinks that they have, as will the fact that Mizzou was outscored 75-10 in those 2 games. Okay. 75-10. I get it. One of them was with Drew Pine. Maybe there's a little bit of grace. Okay. A&M still happened. We were all there for that. Drink is saying that for recruiting. Let's just call it what it is. You give him truth serum. He knows his team is not going to the college football playoff. He knows that the only way in which we're going to have Mizzou and playoff in the same sentence is if he brings it up and makes us talk about it in places like this. That's it. Mizzou is not in the playoff hunt. Maybe recruits can look at the standings and go, oh, this hasn't been as bad of a season as we thought it was actually from this team. I will not be discussing Mizzou playoff credentials any further, okay? Unless all of a sudden the selection committee puts them at 11 or something like that and jumps them 13 spots for finding a way to beat Oklahoma in a wild game at home. Don't think that'll be the case. But great fight. And in the do we still give a crap index, Mizzou passed that test. That is all you can hope for this late in the season if your team does or does not have playoff opportunities. But after you've been humbled pretty significantly by the better competition on your schedule. And they're able to prevent Jackson Arnold from kind of getting the last laugh. And that's good for this Mizzou team, this Mizzou defense, which has been much, much better than I thought they were going to be with Corey Batum. As for Oklahoma, home against Bama at LSU. I think the Sooners just kind of coughed up their bowl berth with that fumble late. I do. At the very least, they're going to be a significant underdog in these last two games. Bye week, then Bama. And then, of course, LSU. You'd probably rather get Bama next week, honestly. Go ask Vandy about getting Bama after a big-time win. But Sooners, even on a day in which they get healthier at receiver, you get Deion Burks back, I just can't find a way. 1-5 in SEC play. Lone win was a game that they should have lost at Auburn, if we're being 100% honest. If Oklahoma loses these next two games and they can't pull an upset, it'll have failed to beat an FBS opponent post-September, and it'll be without a bowl berth for the first time since 1998. That is pre-Bob Stoops. Not exactly what Oklahoma had in mind first year in the SEC. Here's what I'm confident in. I do believe Brent Venables is going to be back. I don't think they're about to pay $39 million to fire him. So if you're continuing to wonder that with that context, I would remember that. Remember the extension that he got 1 week prior to their official move to the SEC this summer. But I do believe that they will spend as much or more than any team in college football to rebuild their offense. That's coordinator, that is quarterback potentially, TBD on this Jackson Arnold thing, that is offensive line, retaining receivers, being able to keep them on board. Oklahoma is going to break the bank to make sure that this offensive season never happens again. That much I know. Pretty telling that their best two offensive plays of the night was a jump pass from a punter, and then as Tom Hart brought up later, a pass from a running back to a quarterback. Not exactly a sign that you got a lot of confidence in your regular offensive scheme, that you got to get that creative. Huge changes coming for the Oklahoma offense, and they will spend big. Maybe they're going to have to overspend to get some of these guys. Maybe they're going to have to get creative with offensive linemen in the portal, but they have got to find a way to make sure this never happens again. And I know injuries are a part of it. They absolutely are. They can't stay healthy at receiver, can't stay healthy on the offensive line. They will spend big. Mark my words. All right, let's close with predicting the playoff top 25. If I get this right now, I'm not going to do anything. If I get this right, I think we will see Oregon stay at number 1 after they beat Maryland. I think Ohio State will be at 2. Texas slides up to 3. They have 1 loss, Georgia fans. I'm sorry. That's the way that this works when you get 2 losses. I know you're unfamiliar with that, but that's how this goes. Penn State will be at 4. And again, these are what I think will happen, not where I would rank these teams. I think Tennessee will be at 5. Indiana at 6. Golly, I did not envision any world in which I was going to have to talk about my alma mater's playoff credentials and toe the line of bias versus unbiased. It's going to be very new. I'm going to struggle with that. I'm admitting that right now. Okay. But able to beat Michigan, get to 10-0. They're going to be 10-0 going into that all important Ohio State game. BYU, I stayed up for that one because I'm a sicko and I was putting together notes for this. They somehow find a way to beat Utah, working with the officials a little bit, or at least according to Utah administration afterwards, who not happy whatsoever with that holding call. I thought that game was absolutely over and Utah was going to win. I had to go back and adjust my rankings to include BYU, but I think they move up to 7 after they were slighted in those first rankings. Bama then, with still 2 losses, their upside is limited, but they will, I think, be at 8. Ole Miss with the 2 losses at 9, slotted right ahead of Georgia, who I have at 10. Notre Dame at 11. Would be weird to see Notre Dame move back a spot after blowing out FSU, but sometimes that just happens with the way that we feel about some of these 2-loss teams. And I think the respect the selection committee is going to want to show to that trio of SEC teams will probably move Notre Dame back slightly. And then Miami rounding out the top 12 at 12. Finally, Cam Ward is unable to put on his cape and lead them back to a comeback. Haynes King leads. And sorry, fade of the week did not hit. Lock of the week hits. That is the good news. But Miami finally suffers a loss, and the ACC is just staring at a one-bid league for the college football playoff. But that's how I think this will go. To recap, Oregon at 1, Ohio State 2, Texas 3, Penn State 4, Tennessee 5, Indiana 6, BYU 7, Alabama 8, Ole Miss 9, Georgia 10, Notre Dame 11, and Miami at 12. We'll have full reactions to that on SaturdayDownSouth.com. We will have a lot of stuff to dig into with the preview pod, maybe a little bit of extended opener with Will's time in Baton Rouge on Saturday, and we'll get a full rundown. Maybe an apology from Will. Maybe can I, guys? Do you think I can get Will to apologize to Kane Womack? You think I can do it? We'll see. We got something to shoot for on the preview pod. If you haven't, leave us a 5-star review. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch every single episode of the Saturday Down South podcast. Follow us on Twitter at the STS Pod, at Sat Down South, at CJ O'Gara, at Go So Hard. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.